When dusk falls over the city, most people hurry home. But on this quiet evening, a little girl stands beneath the faded glow of a bus stop, holding a bag of handmade candles and a handwritten poem. That's how Charles Bennett, a reserved millionaire CEO known for avoiding distractions, first meets Hannah, a 6-year-old with eyes full of light and a mission heavy with heartbreak. She doesn't ask for charity. She offers her skills, candle-making, poetry, and silence, if someone will help save her dying father. But when Charles reads the poem Hannah brings, he freezes. It's nearly identical to one his late sister wrote before she passed. What secret connects them? Stay with us to witness a story of love, poetry, and second chances, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. The elevator doors opened to the 47th floor of the Bennett Tower just as the sun dipped behind the San Francisco skyline. The city below shimmered in gold, but the office remained cold, silent, like its owner. Charles Bennett, 48, sat alone behind a desk carved from black walnut, reviewing investor reports he barely cared about. His name was etched across skyscrapers and tech campuses, but these days, even success felt hollow. His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Mr. Bennett, there's a little girl here to see you." Charles frowned, unsure he'd heard correctly. "A what?" "A girl. About 6 or 7. She says she's here on business." He exhaled sharply. "I don't do drop-ins." "She walked here alone, sir, through downtown. And she's carrying candles." Curiosity trumped protocol. "Send her in." The office doors opened slowly, and in walked a small girl with wind-blushed cheeks, holding a paper bag that smelled faintly of lavender wax. Her boots were 2 sizes too big, and her coat had been patched more than once, but her eyes, big, brown, and earnest, met his without a flinch. "Are you Charles Bennett?" she asked softly. "I am," he replied, leaning back. "And you are?" The girl stepped forward and placed a folded paper on his desk. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "My name is Hannah. I'm 6. I make candles. I know poems. I don't make noise. I want to save my dad." She paused, then pointed to the bottom of the paper. "It says, 'Please help.'" Charles unfolded the note and read the handwriting. Neat, careful, childlike. Each sentence felt like a whisper against the stone wall around his heart. "Where are your parents?" he asked gently. "My mom's gone," she said, not as a tragedy but as a fact. "Just me and Dad now. He's sick, really sick. Liver cancer. The kind that doesn't get better unless you have a lot of money." Her eyes flicked to the glass wall behind him. "I saw your name on a bus stop ad, so I walked here because I thought maybe you could help." Charles looked out the window. Rain had begun tapping at the glass, matching the silence between them. "You walked through the city, alone, at dusk, carrying candles?" She nodded and pulled out one of her creations, a small jar candle with a crooked heart carved into the wax. "I sell them for $5. So far, I have 82. That's not enough for hospitals, but if you hire me, I'll work really hard. I can even memorize poems. Dad used to say words could warm a room faster than fire." A knot formed in Charles's throat, one he hadn't felt in years. "What's your dad's name?" "Mark Dawson. He used to teach poetry at the community college before he got sick." "And where do you live?" "In a room behind the bakery on 9th. The man lets us stay there because my dad used to tutor his daughter. I sleep on a blanket, but it's warm, usually." Charles set the candle on his desk, the flicker of lavender and sorrow lingering in the air. He saw the desperation behind her composure, the courage behind her trembling fingers. The child reminded him of someone. Not just her defiant eyes or her delicate voice, but something deeper, something memory couldn't place. "I don't usually do this," he said quietly. "That's okay," Hannah said. "I didn't come for a miracle, just a job." That broke him a little. A 6-year-old asking to be useful, not pitied. He rose from his seat, walked to the window, and watched the streetlights blur through the mist. "If I wanted to meet your father, would you take me to him?" Her face brightened, like someone had lit a candle inside her. "Really?" she whispered. "Really." She slung her bag over her shoulder, stood straight like a little soldier, and said, "Then we should go now. Visiting hours end at 8. He grabbed his coat without another word. As they exited the building, Charles held the elevator for her. Inside, she glanced up at him and asked, "Do you like poems?" "I used to," he murmured. "Me too," Hannah said, clutching her bag tighter. "But now, I just hope they can help people believe in things again." As the elevator doors closed, Charles realized this wasn't a business deal or an act of charity. It was something else entirely. Something his heart, long silenced, was only just beginning to hear. The cab ride was quiet except for the gentle rattling of glass inside Hannah's candle bag. Charles sat beside her, watching the city blur by. Headlights flickering across windows, pedestrians in thick coats hurrying past puddles. He wasn't sure what had pulled him from the office. Maybe it was the way she stood there, small, brave, burning with purpose. Hannah leaned her head against the window. "We used to take the bus, but it doesn't come near the hospital anymore." "You said your father's name is Mark Dawson?" Charles asked, his voice low. She nodded. "He was a poet. He says words are like blankets. You can wrap people in them when they're cold or scared." Charles smiled faintly. "Sounds like a wise man." "He is. Or he was. He hasn't talked much lately." They pulled up to a squat, aging building with flickering fluorescent lights above a rusted sign. Mission General Hospital. The contrast with Charles's gleaming tower could not have been more stark. "This is it," Hannah said, gripping her bag tightly. "3rd floor, room 312. I'll show you." Inside, the scent of disinfectant lingered heavily, mixing with something older, sadder. The linoleum floor creaked beneath Charles's polished shoes. Nurses moved quickly, heads down. Some glanced at him, puzzled by the presence of a man in a designer coat beside a little girl in worn boots. When they reached the room, Hannah paused. Her fingers hovered over the handle. "Sometimes he's sleeping, but I still talk to him just in case." She pushed the door open. A frail man lay in the bed, his skin tinged yellow beneath the pale hospital lights. Tubes ran from his arms to a machine that beeped steadily beside him. He didn't stir. His cheeks were hollow. His hands, once probably ink-stained, now trembled beneath a thin sheet. "Hi, Daddy," Hannah whispered, stepping inside. "This is the man I told you about, Mr. Charles Bennett." Charles remained in the doorway, moved by the way she gently placed her candle bag at the foot of the bed like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there. She turned to Charles and motioned him forward. "He might not talk, but I think he hears things." Charles stepped closer. On the bedside table was a weathered notebook with a broken spiral and pages curled at the edges. A black pen rested atop it, capped. Beside it, a cracked ceramic mug held wilted paper flowers, little tulips and daffodils, clearly made by Hannah's hands. "This is where I leave my poems for him," she said proudly. "Even if he can't read them right now, I think he still knows." Charles's throat tightened. "Hannah, why me? Why come to me out of everyone in the city?" She turned to him, eyes wide and sincere. "Because your name sounded like someone who still believes in people. And I didn't need the richest man, I just needed the one who'd listen." He felt something shift inside, something old and forgotten. "I want to help," he said softly. She smiled, bright and relieved, and pulled a folded sheet of paper from her coat pocket. "I wrote a new poem today," she said, and placed it on the table next to the notebook. "Would you like to hear it?" Charles hesitated, then nodded. Hannah unfolded the paper carefully and began to recite. He sleeps, but dreams do bloom and drift. In twilight's hush, his soul may lift. A candle glows, a heart still true. The world forgot, except a few. Her voice quivered slightly at the last line, but she straightened her shoulders. I write one every day. Charles sat on the edge of the chair near the bed. The silence in the room felt different now, not empty, but sacred. I'll move him, Charles said suddenly, to a private facility, one with better care, specialists. Hannah's eyes widened. You will? I will. Tonight. She rushed over and threw her arms around his waist before he could stop her. Thank you, Mr. Bennett. Thank you so much. He rested a hand gently on her back. Call me Charles, okay? As they stepped out into the hallway again, Hannah looked up at him and asked, Do you think he'll get better? Charles didn't lie. He looked her straight in the eye and said, I think hope is the first thing that heals, and you've already brought him that. She nodded, as if she understood. Then I'll bring more tomorrow. Outside, night had settled fully over the city. The air smelled of damp pavement and winter coming early. As they waited for his car, Hannah pulled a tiny candle from her bag and handed it to Charles. For your office, she said, so you don't forget. He took it with reverent hands. The scent, lavender and pine, hit him like memory. I won't, he whispered. And for the first time in years, Charles Bennett believed he wouldn't. Not this time. Not with Hannah watching. Not with a promise made beside a man who once wrapped the world in words. By morning, Charles had already made the necessary calls. Hannah didn't know yet. He wanted to do it right, not just fast. He didn't sleep much that night, haunted not by numbers or projections, but by the sight of a little girl pressing poems against the bedside of a dying man. The next day, he returned to the hospital with a quiet urgency. Room 312 looked the same, but something had shifted. Hannah was sitting on the windowsill with a candle in her lap, whispering a story to it, as if hoping the wax and wick might carry it to the sky. She looked up and smiled faintly. He didn't wake up, but I told him about your candle. I think he liked that. Charles knelt beside her. I have something to tell you, too. We're moving your dad to a better place. Today. Her eyes widened. Like, now? He nodded gently. An ambulance is coming in an hour. Specialists will meet him there. It's one of the best hospitals in the state, Hannah. He'll be in good hands. Hannah blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears. Then she nodded slowly. Does he get his own room? He does. Can I still read to him? Every single day. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a long moment, they didn't say anything. Silence had become their language. It was heavier than words, but more honest. The transfer was smooth. Hannah rode in the ambulance while Charles followed behind in his car. The private facility stood in stark contrast to the one they left. White-walled, sun-filled, calm. When Mark was wheeled into the room, Hannah placed her newest poem beside his bed without a word. She then turned to Charles and asked, Can we light a candle here? He asked the nurse, who hesitated but finally relented, placing it in a covered jar for safety. Hannah lit it carefully and whispered, So he knows we're close. Charles stayed late. He watched her talk about her favorite books, how her dad used to sing Bob Dylan lullabies, and how her mom, whom she barely remembered, had taught her to make paper stars before she passed away. Her voice never rose, never cracked. It was calm, brave, and heartbreakingly old for 6. Do you ever get scared? Charles finally asked. She looked at him, thoughtful. Sometimes. But being scared doesn't mean you give up. He swallowed hard, blinking away something sharp behind his eyes. That night, she pulled something else from her little backpack, a folded, yellowing page of notebook paper. I brought this, she said, handing it to him. It's my favorite poem, It's not mine. I found it in an old box of my dad's. He said he didn't write it." Charles took the page carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable. His breath caught in his throat. He had seen this poem before. Not read it, seen it. The loops in the letters, the gentle slope of the lines. His sister used to write like this. His hands trembled. He read, "The dusk is kind when dreams have flown. It holds the ones who feel alone. And if you light a single flame, you'll find that love still knows your name." It was hers. Charles stared at the final signature at the bottom corner. Just 2 letters, like always, L.B. Lillian Bennett. His sister. Gone these past 10 years, lost to the ocean that night off Cape May. But this poem, this was hers, undeniably. His voice shook. "Where did you say you found this?" Hannah pointed to her bag. It was inside a candle box, one of the old ones. Dad said he didn't know who wrote it, but he liked it too much to throw away. Charles sat back, stunned. His sister had loved candles. She used to write poetry late at night in her dorm room, by candlelight. She used to say the flicker helped her think better than any lamp. The memories rushed back like a current. Lillian scribbling stanzas by moonlight, quoting Rilke while baking muffins, knitting scarves for charity drives with an intensity that always made him laugh. He stared at Hannah now, her eyes bright with innocence and hope, a little girl who sold candles at dusk, carrying poetry in her pockets and warmth in her palms. "You said your father's name is Mark?" She nodded. "And he writes too?" "Wrote," she said quietly. "He hasn't in a while." Charles stared at the poem again. A thread of fate seemed to wind its way through the paper, as if the universe was whispering something it had kept hidden for too long. He stood and walked to the window, staring out into the darkening sky. The city shimmered below, but his mind was elsewhere, on a sister lost, a man sleeping, and a girl who carried both love and memory like a candle she refused to let die. Behind him, Hannah yawned. "Do you think he'll wake up tomorrow?" Charles turned back, voice soft. "I think he's already starting to." She nodded and laid her head against the pillow beside her father. Charles pulled a chair next to them and sat in silence, the poem still in his hand, the candle flickering quietly between them. Something was returning to him, something he hadn't known he'd lost. And it started with a poem, written in a stranger's hands, recited by a girl who simply refused to give up. The following morning arrived with a soft drizzle tapping against the hospital window panes. Charles sat slouched in the chair beside Mark's bed, the poem still folded in his coat pocket like a secret he hadn't fully unraveled. Hannah was already awake, humming quietly while peeling the label off a tiny jar candle. She did it absent-mindedly, focused instead on her father's still face. "Did he move?" Charles asked gently. Hannah shook her head. "But I think he smiled a little. Right here." She touched the faint crease at the corner of Mark's mouth. "I think he knows he's not alone anymore." Charles exhaled slowly. The room smelled faintly of lavender and warm wax. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like running from silence. "You love him a lot," he said. Hannah looked up, her voice unwavering. "He's the best person I know. Even when he's sick, he makes me feel safe." Charles didn't respond immediately. He glanced at Mark, the man who had unknowingly held on to his sister's poem all these years. The man whose daughter now sat before him with the same quiet courage Lillian once carried into every room. "How did you and your dad start making candles?" he asked softly. Hannah smiled. "He said light makes people feel less afraid. When Mom passed, we lit a candle every night before bed. At first I thought it was for her, but then I realized it was for us." Her words landed heavy on Charles's heart. "I used to light candles with someone too," he admitted. "My sister. She was poetic, like you." "What happened to her?" Hannah asked, genuinely curious but gentle in tone. "She died in an accident. 10 years ago. We never found her. Only her journal." Hannah tilted her head. "Do you miss her every day?" He nodded. "More than I can explain." There was a long pause before Hannah reached into her bag and pulled out another candle, this one shaped like a tiny house with windows and a crooked chimney molded into the wax. "I made this one for you," she said, "because everyone needs somewhere to come home to." Charles stared at the little wax house in awe. "You made this?" "Yup. Took 3 tries. But I thought, maybe it could be your memory house, for her." Something in Charles's chest cracked open. He took the candle with both hands, almost reverently. "Thank you, Hannah," he whispered. "This means more than you know." They sat together in the stillness, 2 souls from wildly different worlds, joined by the flicker of a shared grief and the warmth of a healing bond. Later that afternoon, Charles received a call from his office. "I'm taking the week off," he said before his assistant could list the day's obligations. "No, don't transfer calls. Just send over the files I requested." When he turned back, Hannah was asleep beside her father, curled like a kitten, her tiny hand resting on Mark's unmoving fingers. Charles adjusted the blanket over her and then stepped out into the hallway, where he finally allowed the emotional weight of the past 48 hours to settle in. He pulled out the poem again. The rhythm, the phrasing, the echo of Lillian's voice. It wasn't just coincidence. He called the number he hadn't dialed in years. "Paula, it's Charles. I need a favor. Do you still have Lillian's old manuscripts?" The voice on the other end was stunned. "Charles? After all this time, I think I found one that was never published. Or passed down somehow. I need to verify if it was hers." There was a pause, then a soft, "I'll look tonight. Come by tomorrow." As he hung up, Charles felt the pull of the past threading itself through the present. Lillian's words, Hannah's eyes, Mark's fading strength. It all formed a quiet chord of fate. He returned to the hospital room and found Hannah awake, her eyes watching the candle on the side table flicker delicately. "Do you believe some things happen on purpose?" she asked suddenly. Charles sat beside her. "I used to think everything was random, but now I think, maybe not." She nodded slowly. "Me too." They sat in silence again, but this time it felt different. Full, not empty. The kind of silence that wraps around you like a warm coat. Mark stirred slightly in his bed. Hannah gasped, eyes wide. Charles leaned forward. Mark's eyelids twitched, then slowly fluttered open. "Dad?" Hannah whispered, gripping his hand. Mark's lips parted, dry and cracked. "Hannah?" It was barely audible, but it was there. Charles's breath caught in his throat. "I'm here, Daddy," she said, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You're okay." Mark's gaze drifted toward Charles, lingering. His brows furrowed faintly. "Who?" Charles moved closer. "I'm Charles, a friend. I'm the one helping take care of you and Hannah." Mark's eyes searched his face. Slowly, a look of faint recognition emerged, but not for Charles, for something deeper, buried. Charles gently placed the folded poem on Mark's chest. "You've been carrying something precious," he said, "something that belonged to my sister." Mark's eyes widened slightly as his fingers brushed the page. "You knew her, didn't you?" Charles asked, voice thick with emotion. Mark managed the faintest nod. And just like that, a hidden thread of the past began to weave itself back into the fabric of the present. That night, as the wind whispered against the hospital windows and the city lights shimmered beyond the horizon, Charles sat on the edge of the room's narrow couch, watching the rise and fall of Mark's chest. It was steady now. Not strong, but steady, and that alone felt like a small miracle. Across from him, Hannah had fallen asleep curled up with one of her candle jars, clutching it like a child might a teddy bear. Her breathing was calm, rhythmic. It soothed him in a way he hadn't expected. Mark's voice had only returned for a moment, just enough to say his daughter's name and look Charles in the eye, but it was enough to stir something that had long been buried. That recognition. It wasn't just human gratitude. It was something more. It was memory. Charles reached for the folded poem once more. The edges were soft now from how often he had held it. He read it aloud under his breath, not for the first time. The stars don't shout. They wait and glow, for those too hurt to hope or know that someone's light still sees them whole and holds them safe and makes them whole. A poem about waiting. A poem about faith. His sister, Lillian, had written something almost identical when she was 17, but that version had ended differently. This one had been reshaped, gentler, and yet the soul of it, the ache and the tenderness, remained unchanged. It couldn't be coincidence. Mark stirred again. Charles leaned forward. "Mark, it's me, Charles Bennett. We met briefly when you came to my sister's reading, years ago. I was the one in the back of the room, too afraid to speak." Mark's eyelids fluttered, but stayed closed. Charles hesitated, then continued, his voice cracking. "I never thanked you. You were the last person who understood her poems, who really heard her. I shut that part of her away. I didn't know how to carry her words, but you carried them." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. Then, from Mark's barely moving lips came a word. "She saved me." Charles blinked hard. "What do you mean?" "Lillian, her poem. I read it the night I almost gave up, before I met Claire, before Hannah." A pause. "She didn't know it, but she kept me alive." Charles swallowed the lump in his throat. "And now, your daughter brought her words back to me. That's not an accident." In the stillness, something fragile but real passed between the two men. Neither spoke for a while. The next morning, Charles made a decision. He stepped outside into the brisk air, made a few calls, and by noon, Mark had been officially transferred to one of the top private hospitals in the state. When the ambulance arrived, Hannah gripped Charles's hand tightly. "Is this okay? He doesn't like change." Charles knelt beside her. "Hannah, your dad is going to be somewhere he can really heal now, and I'm going to be there with both of you. Every step." Her eyes welled up, but she nodded bravely. "Okay, but can we still bring his poems? He needs those." Charles smiled. "Yes, all of them." As they loaded into the ambulance, Charles made sure the folder with Mark's poetry was tucked beneath Hannah's arm. The girl carried it like sacred treasure. At the new hospital, everything changed. Mark was placed in a sunlit room with warm blankets and a view of a garden courtyard. He had a new care team, specialists who greeted him like he mattered, not like a burden. And most of all, he had Hannah, now brighter than ever, racing through the halls with her small bag of candles and her fierce hope. That first evening, she insisted on lighting one near the window. "For healing," she said, "and for poetry." Charles watched her, deeply moved. "Do you write your own poems, Hannah?" "Sometimes," she replied, "but I like reading Dad's better, and your sister's." Charles tilted his head. "You knew they were hers?" Hannah nodded. "The first time I read that one, I felt something, like I'd heard it before, even though I hadn't. That's how I know it's real." Charles blinked against the sting in his eyes. "She would have loved you." Hannah smiled and handed him another tiny candle, shaped like a heart. "For when you miss her, so she can still glow." Charles held it gently, his fingers trembling around its ridged edges. "I think she sent you," he whispered. Hannah didn't answer. She just climbed into the hospital bed beside her father, curling close to his side like she belonged there, and Charles realized, with a bittersweet ache, that she did. As the candle flickered in the dim light and the scent of beeswax and lavender filled the room, Charles pulled out his phone and typed one simple message. To Paula. Subject, Lillian's legacy message. I found where it lives, and I'm not walking away again. The hospital room glowed with a quiet, golden light as dusk spilled through the windows. Hannah sat beside her father, humming softly, her tiny fingers threading a fresh wick through a mold. She worked patiently, deliberately, the way she had seen Charles do earlier in the lounge. Charles, seated across the room in a low chair, was scribbling into a leather-bound journal, his sister's journal, the one he'd hidden away in a locked drawer for over a decade. Today, he'd finally opened it again, not as a ritual, not as a relic, but as something living. As the scent of wax and lavender filled the air, Hannah broke the silence. Would it be okay if I read you a new poem? Charles looked up, moved by the innocence in her voice. Of course. I'd love that. She pulled a crumpled page from her jacket pocket and carefully unfolded it. Her voice was soft but confident. A candle doesn't chase the dark. It only says, come near my spark. And though the night might stretch and swell, it can't put out a heart that dwells. She glanced up. I wrote it yesterday, after the nurses said Dad might not wake up today. Charles stared at her, his breath caught in his throat. The words were so small, so gentle, but the truth in them shook him. That's beautiful, Hannah, he said earnestly. It's full of truth. She smiled shyly. It's what Aunt Lillian would have said, right? Charles paused, his eyes burning. Yeah, that's exactly what she would have said. Silence folded over them for a moment, and then Hannah reached into her backpack and took out a folded piece of paper. This one was aged, creased so many times the edges had begun to fray. She held it out. My dad wrote this a long time ago, she said. He gave it to me when I was little. I didn't understand it back then, but I kept it. Now I read it whenever I'm scared. Charles took the paper with reverent hands. As he read the lines, he froze. The words weren't just familiar, they were hers. Lillian's, word for word. It was the last poem she ever read aloud before disappearing from his life entirely. He remembered her whispering it in the back of that dusty church hall, her voice trembling, her hands gripping the mic like a lifeline. She called it, For the Child I Haven't Met Yet. And here it was, in his hands again, but this time written in Mark's handwriting, annotated, cherished. Charles stared across the room toward Mark, still unconscious but breathing stronger now. He saved her, by saving her words. Hannah, watching him, tilted her head. You look like you're remembering something good. Charles looked back at her and nodded slowly. I think I'm remembering why I was put in your path. Later that evening, as Charles stood in the hallway outside Mark's room, one of the nurses approached him with a clipboard and a curious expression. Mr. Bennett, she said carefully. The social worker overseeing Hannah's case wanted to know, are you listed as next of kin or guardian? Charles blinked. I'm not, he replied slowly, but I'd like to be, if that's possible. The nurse gave a gentle smile. Well, Hannah seems to think of you that way already. As she walked away, Charles leaned against the wall, emotions crashing over him. He wasn't sure when it had happened, when the line between benefactor and family had blurred, but now there was no question left in his heart. He belonged to them, and they belonged to him. The next morning brought a miracle. Charles arrived early, a tray of breakfast in one hand and a sketchbook in the other. He found Hannah already awake, reading aloud to her father. Mark's eyes fluttered, half open, hazy, but unmistakably aware. Daddy? Hannah whispered, crawling up beside him. Mark's fingers moved slightly, and his lips formed her name, barely audible, but filled with more love than the room could hold. Charles stepped into the room as Hannah turned to him, her eyes full of radiant tears. "He said my name," she whispered joyfully. "He's still here." Charles walked over, placing the tray down quietly. "We're going to get him all the way back, Hannah. I promised you, remember?" She nodded, grabbing his hand and squeezing it with a strength far beyond her years. Then, as if remembering something vital, she reached into her backpack and pulled out her candle, her very first one, rough-edged and tiny with a speckled blue rim. She handed it to Charles. "Can we light this today? Just for hope?" He smiled gently and struck a match, holding it to the wick until the flame flickered to life. The light danced between them all, casting soft shadows over the walls. Charles sat beside her, watching as Mark stirred again, stronger this time. And for the first time in years, Charles whispered to the flickering flame, "Thank you, Lillian. I finally understand what you meant." Mark's breathing grew steadier over the next few days. His recovery, though slow, was no longer just a hopeful dream. It was happening. Every morning, Charles arrived at the hospital with fresh soup, sketchbooks, and scented oils for candle making. And every evening, he stayed late with Hannah, reading poems, helping her color, or just sitting quietly as the monitor beside Mark's bed beeped like a metronome of second chances. Hannah, ever bright, was becoming more animated. The weight she carried when she first walked into Charles's office had begun to lift. Her laughter came easier now, pure, twinkling, and unguarded. One night, as snow began dusting the windows again, Charles brought in a small wooden box. He placed it gently on the foot of the hospital bed and turned to Hannah. "I thought we could try something different," he said. She raised a curious eyebrow. "What is it?" Charles opened the box. Inside were rows of hand-carved candle molds, delicate and ornate, some shaped like blooming flowers, others like open books. "These used to belong to my sister," he said softly. "Lillian. She made candles too, for years. Said everyone was like a poem in wax." Hannah ran her finger along the edge of a rose-shaped mold, whispering, "Like a little poem that burns." Charles smiled, nodding. "Exactly." They spent the evening crafting candles together. Charles showed her how to mix oils just right, how to tilt the wick at a perfect angle, how to steady her hand even when the wax got messy. And Hannah? She taught Charles how to be still, how to giggle when wax dripped on your nose, how to name every candle something whimsical, like Midnight Garden or Courage Light. It was the first time in decades Charles had felt the gentle joy of creating, not for commerce or reputation, but for connection. That night, after tucking a blanket over her shoulders, Charles sat by Mark again. The hospital room was dim, but the candle on the windowsill flickered with warmth. "She reminds me of her," Charles murmured. "But she's got something else, too. She's got you." Mark didn't open his eyes, but a flicker of recognition stirred in his brow. "I'm sorry we never met sooner," Charles continued, his voice breaking, "but I'm here now, and I'm not leaving." Just then, a quiet knock at the door. It was the social worker, a woman named Carol with kind eyes and a worn clipboard. "Mr. Bennett," she said gently, "may I speak with you for a moment?" Charles stepped outside the room, heart tensing. "I've been reviewing Hannah's case," Carol said, flipping through the papers. "With her father incapacitated and no extended family listed, we've been looking into temporary guardianship options." Charles stiffened. "What kind of options?" "Foster placement, possibly out of county," Carol said. "Unless there's someone willing to take legal guardianship. Someone stable, responsible, and clearly bonded to the child." Charles's chest tightened. The idea of Hannah being taken from Mark, even temporarily, was unbearable. "I'll do it," he said, without hesitation. "Whatever paperwork, Background checks, court proceedings, you name it. I'll take her. She's already family." Carol looked up from her clipboard, eyes softening. "You understand what that means, Mr. Bennett?" He nodded. "She walked into my life with a candle and a poem, and somehow she lit up something I thought I'd lost. That girl. She saved me, too." The following day, Charles told Hannah about the guardianship process. She was sitting cross-legged in the hospital courtyard, coloring a label for their latest candle. Hope in winter. "You'd really want to be my guardian?" she asked, unsure. "I'd be honored," he said sincerely, "but only if you're okay with that." Hannah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took out her notebook and scribbled something. She tore the page out and handed it to him. It read, "A family isn't born. Sometimes it knocks with a candle in hand." Charles's eyes welled up. He knelt, pulling her into a hug. "Then let's keep the flame going, Hannah." In that moment, something changed. Quietly, but profoundly. A new chapter opened, not one built on blood or obligation, but on poems, promises, and the light between them. The winter sun stretched its tired arms over the city, casting long shadows across the hospital room where Mark lay. It had been 2 days since Charles agreed to pursue legal guardianship of Hannah, and in that short time, a strange but comforting rhythm had taken hold. Mornings of quiet candle-making with Hannah, afternoons of slow recovery updates from Mark's doctors, and evenings filled with poetry readings that drifted like lullabies through the sterile walls. That morning, Charles brought Hannah a surprise, a small artist's satchel. Inside were pastel wax colors, delicate paper, and calligraphy pens. "What's all this for?" she asked, eyes wide with delight. "For your poems," he said gently. "I figured if we're going to sell candles with names like Moonlight Courage and Sunset Kindness, we might as well make the labels just as beautiful." Hannah hugged the satchel to her chest. "You believe in my poems?" "I do," Charles replied sincerely. "They're more than words. They're memories, feelings, and sometimes they remind us of people we miss." A stillness passed between them. Hannah opened the satchel and pulled out a folded, crinkled page from her coat pocket. "This one," she said, handing it to him, "is special. I wrote it for Dad." Charles unfolded the page with care. The handwriting was uneven but tender. The title read, "The Lantern I Keep." As he read the lines aloud, verses about lighting candles in the dark, of keeping hope glowing for someone you love. His voice slowed at the final stanza, "And if one day I cannot see, let someone hold the light for me. With wax and wick and whispered song, they'll carry me when days are long." Charles's breath caught in his throat. The phrasing, the rhythm, it was uncannily familiar. He sat down, frowning softly, and reached into the inside pocket of his coat. From it, he pulled a weathered leather notebook, his sister's last poetry journal, the one she had left behind before she passed away 5 years earlier. Flipping carefully through the pages, his fingers paused on a poem titled "Hold the Light." He read both side by side. The parallels were undeniable. They didn't just echo each other, they sang from the same soul. He looked at Hannah, who was now busy drawing swirls of gold and lavender on a candle label. "Hannah," he asked gently, "who taught you to write like this?" She blinked. "No one, really. I feel things, and sometimes the words come. My dad says it's because I was born with a poet's heart, and my mom, before she left, used to sing verses to me when I couldn't sleep." Charles's chest tightened. "Your mom? Did she write too?" "Dad said she loved poems," Hannah replied, her tone wistful, "but she passed when I was a baby. I never got to know her." Charles stared at the poem again. It wasn't just similar. The opening line mirrored the one his sister had once written for him as a child. He leaned back, stunned. Could it be possible? Could Hannah's late mother have been... Suddenly, A knock at the door pulled him out of the spiral. A nurse entered, cheerful and breathless. "Mr. Bennett? Mr. Daniels is awake. He's asking for his daughter." Hannah leapt up so quickly she nearly spilled the wax pot. "He's awake?" Charles smiled, misty-eyed. "Go see him. He's been waiting." She raced down the hall, her little boots thumping like a melody of hope. Charles followed more slowly, heart pounding. When he entered the room, he saw Hannah standing by the bed, holding Mark's hand, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Daddy," she whispered, "you came back." Mark, though weak, managed a soft smile. "I could never leave you, sweet pea." Then his eyes shifted, and he saw Charles. "Are you Charles Bennett?" he asked, voice raspy but clear. Charles nodded. "I am." Mark blinked slowly. "You helped her. You saved her." "No," Charles replied, his voice thick with emotion. "She saved me." Mark studied him for a long moment. Then, with trembling fingers, he motioned toward the nightstand. "There's a photo in my wallet. Her mother. You should see it." Charles picked up the worn wallet, flipped it open, and froze. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman with dark curls, a joyful smile, and a tiny mole beneath her right eye. Lillian. His sister. Time collapsed inward. The truth roared through his veins. Hannah was his niece. He sat down, stunned. Mark seemed to read his expression. "She never told me much about her family," Mark murmured. "Just that she had a brother she lost contact with, someone she missed." Charles felt the burn of uncried tears. "That was me." They were quiet for a long time. Finally, Mark whispered, "Then maybe this wasn't a coincidence." "No," Charles said softly. "It was a poem in motion, one that started years ago and somehow found its way home." The snow had stopped falling that evening, but inside the private recovery room at Crestview Medical, emotions still drifted like flurries, soft, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. Mark Daniels slept soundly for the first time in days, his chest rising with the steadiness of a man no longer running from the shadows of pain. Charles sat in the armchair by the window, the photo of Lillian still clutched gently in his hands. He hadn't seen her in over a decade before her death. Pride and silence had built a canyon between them neither had known how to cross. And yet, here it was, her legacy, her daughter, her poetry, her light. Hannah had fallen asleep in a tiny armchair at the edge of her father's bed, her small fingers wrapped tightly around his pinky. A nightlight glowed on the counter, casting flickers across her freckled cheeks. Beside her lay the satchel Charles had given her, its zipper half open, a candle labeled Lantern Hope resting beside a folded poem titled Auntie Lily. He stared at it for a long moment, then quietly reached for it. The poem was simple, rhymed, childlike in rhythm, but aching in honesty. It spoke of a woman Hannah never met but dreamed of, someone whose voice she imagined when thunder scared her, someone whose words she said floated on her dreams like lullabies on the wind. Charles choked back tears. "You always had a way with words, Lily," he whispered. "Even after everything. You still found your way back." The next morning brought sun and movement. Mark sat up in bed, pale but alert. Hannah practically glowed with joy, feeding him tiny bites of applesauce as if it were the most sacred ritual. Charles stood by with coffee and quiet admiration. After the nurse left, Mark spoke softly. "She told me what you've done. Everything. I don't know how to—" "You don't need to thank me," Charles interrupted gently. "This was never about obligation." Mark studied him. "Then what was it about?" Charles exhaled. "Redemption. I never got to fix what I broke with Lillian. I can't change the past, but I can make sure her daughter, your daughter, doesn't carry the weight of that silence." Mark's gaze softened. You're not the man I expected to meet. Neither are you, Charles said with a quiet smile. Later that afternoon, Hannah invited Charles to join her in the hospital's tiny art room. The nurse had cleared a corner and brought in a small folding table, and there, with candle wax, glitter, and scraps of construction paper, Hannah had set up her makeshift studio. "I made one for you," she said, holding up a small candle jar with a label that read, "You found me." Charles took it, overcome. "This is perfect." Hannah beamed. "It smells like cinnamon and stories. I thought that was your smell." He laughed quietly, deeply. "I'll take it." They worked together for hours, her melting wax and sketching ideas, him carefully helping glue labels and trim wicks. For the first time in years, Charles felt free. Not from business, not from success or stress, but from the gnawing loneliness he'd worn like a second skin since Lillian died. At one point, Hannah leaned her cheek on his shoulder and whispered, "Can we keep doing this? Even after Daddy comes home?" Charles turned to her, his voice trembling. "Yes, as long as you want." That night, back in his hotel suite, Charles sat at the edge of his bed, staring at an unopened email from his executive assistant. He'd canceled 2 meetings, delayed a quarterly board report, and ignored 6 investor calls. But none of that mattered. Not compared to this. The world he'd spent his whole life building, the glass towers, the $100 million deals, the airtight contracts, had never once given him what this little girl had in just a few days: purpose. With a resolute breath, he pulled out his laptop and opened a blank document. At the top, he typed, "The Bennett Family Foundation, Phase 1, Hannah's Light Initiative." His fingers moved faster than they had in years, fueled not by ambition, but love. The next morning, he returned to the hospital with a surprise. "Hannah," he said, handing her a tiny printed brochure mock-up, "what do you think of this?" She opened it slowly. Her mouth dropped open. The front page read, "Hannah's Light, Handmade Candles and Poems That Heal." On the inside, a mission statement about raising money for families facing medical hardship through the sale of handmade poem-labeled candles, featuring Hannah as creative director, age 6. "You made this real?" she gasped. He knelt to her level. "We made it real, and it's just the beginning." She hugged him fiercely. "You're my candle now," she whispered. "You help me see in the dark." Charles hugged her back, his throat tight with emotion. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't just fixing something broken. He was building something whole. The afternoon sunlight poured through the high hospital windows, brushing the white linens with a golden hue. A quiet hum of machines marked the rhythm of the room, soft and steady like a lullaby. Mark stirred. At first it was a twitch in his fingers, barely noticeable, then a shift in his breathing, and finally, a voice. "Hannah." Charles, seated in the armchair by the bedside with a book of poems in his lap, froze. His eyes lifted to meet the nurses, who'd just entered the room with a tray. "He spoke," Charles whispered, his voice cracking. "He said her name." The nurse blinked, then rushed to Mark's side, gently taking his pulse, adjusting the monitors. "Mark, can you hear me? You're in the hospital. You've been very sick." Mark blinked slowly. His lips moved again. "Hannah." Charles stepped back, overwhelmed. Then he turned toward the door. "She's down the hall. I'll bring her." In the hospital's tiny recreation room, Hannah was working diligently on her next batch of candle jars. Glitter dusted her hands and nose. Charles knelt beside her and gently touched her shoulder. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "your dad just woke up." Hannah looked up, stunned. "Really? Is he?" "He said your name." She gasped, then dropped the candle in her hand, jumping up and racing past Charles without hesitation. He followed closely, his heart pounding, not with fear, but with hope. When Hannah entered the room, Mark's eyes opened fully. He smiled weakly as his daughter flung her arms around him. "Daddy," she cried, sobbing into his chest, "I missed you so much. I brought you candles and poems, and Charles, he helped. He made everything better." Mark's trembling hand rose slowly and stroked her hair. "You kept your promise," he murmured. "You didn't give up." Charles stood silently in the doorway, watching the reunion with misty eyes. Something inside him, something long buried, broke open. Later that evening, after Mark had eaten his first solid meal and was able to sit up with pillows propped behind him, he turned to Charles. "I don't know how to say thank you," he said. "You didn't know us. You didn't have to help." Charles stepped closer, his voice low and reverent. "I didn't know you, but I knew your words, and I knew hers." Mark blinked, confused. "Hers?" Charles pulled the folded poem from his pocket and handed it over. "This was in Hannah's bag. She said you wrote it, but I recognized it. My sister Lillian wrote this, word for word. She used to read it to me before she passed." Mark looked down at the paper, then up at Charles, stunned. "Lillian was your sister?" Charles nodded. "You knew her?" Mark's eyes softened. "She was my mentor at the community center. When I was 17, she taught me how to write with feeling instead of just rhyme. That poem, she gave it to me when I graduated the program." Charles's chest tightened. "She never told me about mentoring anyone, but she always said poetry belonged to the people who needed it most." Tears slipped down Mark's cheeks. "I copied it in my own handwriting and gave it to Hannah when she was little. It was my way of keeping her memory alive." They sat in silence for a long moment, the past and present folding into something sacred between them. A few days later, the social worker returned. This time, not with questions, but with an offer. "Mr. Bennett," she began gently, "in light of what you've provided, not just financially but emotionally, the court would be open to assigning temporary guardianship. If something were to happen again, you'd have full access to care for Hannah." Mark looked over at Charles, then to Hannah, who was coloring in the corner with a rainbow crayon. "I'd like that," Mark said quietly, "but only if she chooses." Hannah looked up at the sound of her name. "Choose what?" Charles knelt beside her. "They're asking if I can be your helper, your candle-making partner, your backup grown-up. What do you think?" She stared at him, then threw her arms around his neck. "You already are." Later that night, the hospital room glowed with soft candlelight, not from flickering wax flames, but from battery-powered versions of Hannah's creations, gifted by the nurses who had all become fans. Charles stood at the window, looking out at the city below. Mark joined him, leaning on his IV pole. "You changed her life, Charles." "No," Charles replied softly. "She changed mine." And in that moment, two fathers, two poets, and one brilliant little girl became something more than fate had planned. They became a family stitched together by verses, candles, and quiet promises kept. Charles Bennett had closed billion-dollar deals. He'd stood on stages beside governors, held courtrooms in silence, and rebuilt entire neighborhoods with the stroke of a pen. But nothing had prepared him for the weight of the question the social worker asked a week later in the hospital's sunroom. "Mr. Bennett, are you willing to be Hannah's legal guardian?" The words were gentle, but they landed like thunder. Across from him, Hannah sat cross-legged on the floor, humming softly as she arranged lavender-scented candles into heart shapes. Mark, thinner but stronger now, dozed quietly in a chair nearby, a knit blanket draped across his lap. Charles didn't answer right away. He looked at Hannah, the fierce little girl who had walked into his office at dusk, clutching candles and poems like they were lifelines. He thought of her hands, cracked from winter wind, and her eyes, wise beyond her 6 years. He thought of Lillian. His sister had always said love isn't something you say, it's something you do. And in every act, in every breath since that night, Hannah had reminded him of that. He finally spoke, his voice steady. Yes, I want to be her guardian, if Mark agrees. The social worker smiled. Mark already signed. He said, and I quote, "If I could handpick someone to raise Hannah, it would be the man who listened to her poetry." Charles blinked hard. Then it's yes. Absolutely yes. That night, they held a quiet dinner together in Mark's hospital room. Grilled cheese sandwiches, tomato soup, and apple slices arranged into candle shapes by the nurses. Hannah bounced between the bed and the table. "This is like Thanksgiving, but with fluorescent lights and hand sanitizer." Mark chuckled, his voice still raspy but alive. "It's the first meal I've eaten with flavor in weeks." Charles smiled, but the emotion rising in his throat nearly choked him. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the glowing skyline. "I never had kids," he said quietly. "I told myself I was too busy, too focused, that love was complicated." He turned back around, his gaze falling on Hannah. "But you changed that. You made it simple." She tilted her head, murmured, "You didn't give up." Charles stood silently in the doorway, watching the reunion with misty eyes. Something inside him, something long buried, broke open. Later that evening, after Mark had eaten his first solid meal and was able to sit up with pillows propped behind him, he turned to Charles. "I don't know how to say thank you," he said. "You didn't know us. You didn't have to help." Charles stepped closer, his voice low and reverent. "I didn't know you, but I knew your words, and I knew hers." Mark blinked, confused. "Hers?" Charles pulled the folded poem from his pocket and handed it over. This was in Hannah's bag. "She said you wrote it, but—" "I recognized it. My sister Lillian wrote this, word for word. She used to read it to me before she passed." Mark looked down at the paper, then up at Charles, stunned. "Lillian was your sister?" Charles nodded. "You knew her?" Mark's eyes softened. "She was my mentor, at the community center, when I was 17. She taught me how to write with feeling instead of just rhyme. That poem, she gave it to me when I graduated the program." Charles's chest tightened. "She never told me about mentoring anyone, but she always said poetry belonged to the people who needed it most." Tears slipped down Mark's cheeks. "I copied it in my own handwriting and gave it to Hannah when she was little. It was my way of keeping her memory alive." They sat in silence for a long moment, the past and present folding into something sacred between them. A few days later, the social worker returned, this time not with questions, but with an offer. "Mr. Bennett," she began gently, "in light of what you've provided, not just financially but emotionally, the court would be open to assigning temporary guardianship. If something were to happen again, you'd have full access to care for Hannah." Mark looked over at Charles, then to Hannah, who was coloring in the corner with a rainbow crayon. "I'd like that," Mark said quietly, "but only if she chooses." Hannah looked up at the sound of her name. "Choose what?" Charles knelt beside her. "They're asking if I can be your helper, your candle-making partner, your backup grown-up. What do you think?" She stared at him, then threw her arms around his neck. "You already are." Later that night, the hospital room glowed with soft candlelight, not from flickering wax flames, but from battery-powered versions of Hannah's creations, gifted by the nurses who had all become fans. Charles stood at the window, looking out at the city below. Mark joined him, leaning on his IV pole. "You changed her life, Charles." "No," Charles replied softly. "She changed mine." And in that moment, two fathers, two poets, and one brilliant little girl became something more than fate had planned. They became a family stitched together by verses, candles, and quiet promises kept. Charles Bennett had closed billion-dollar deals. He'd stood on stages beside governors, held courtrooms in silence, and rebuilt entire neighborhoods with the stroke of a pen. But nothing had prepared him for the weight of the question the social worker asked a week later in the hospital's sunroom. "Mr. Bennett, are you willing to be Hannah's legal guardian?" The words were gentle, but they landed like thunder. Across from him, Hannah sat cross-legged on the floor, humming softly as she arranged lavender-scented candles into heart shapes. Mark, thinner but stronger now, dozed quietly in a chair nearby, a knit blanket draped across his lap. Charles didn't answer right away. He looked at Hannah, the fierce little girl who had walked into his office at dusk, clutching candles and poems like they were lifelines. He thought of her hands, cracked from winter wind, and her eyes, wise beyond her 6 years. He thought of Lillian. His sister had always said love isn't something you say. It's something you do, and in every act, in every breath since that night, Hannah had reminded him of that. He finally spoke, his voice steady. "Yes, I want to be her guardian, if Mark agrees." The social worker smiled. Mark already signed. He said, and I quote, "If I could handpick someone to raise Hannah, it would be the man who listened to her poetry." Charles blinked hard. "Then it's yes. Absolutely yes." That night, they held a quiet dinner together in Mark's hospital room. Grilled cheese sandwiches, tomato soup, and apple slices arranged into candle shapes by the nurses. Hannah bounced between the bed and the table. "This is like Thanksgiving, but with fluorescent lights and hand sanitizer." Mark chuckled, his voice still raspy but alive. "It's the first meal I've eaten with flavor in weeks." Charles smiled, but the emotion rising in his throat nearly choked him. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the glowing skyline. "I never had kids," he said quietly. "I told myself I was too busy, too focused, that love was complicated." He turned back around, his gaze falling on Hannah. "But you changed that. You made it simple." She tilted her head. "We're a quiet joy." Mornings were filled with hot cocoa and laughter. Mark regained enough strength to read aloud with Hannah, his voice steady and rich. Charles, in turn, taught them both how to cook simple meals and take long walks along the pier. And, on weekends, they made candles. Together, not for profit, not for recognition, but for memory. Each candle had a scent, a name, a moment. One morning, as Hannah carefully labeled a rose-scented candle, she asked, "Do you think Aunt Lillian would have liked this one?" Charles smiled softly. "She would have adored it. She would have said it smelled like hope." Hannah nodded solemnly. "Then let's name it that." That afternoon, they delivered a basket of candles to the children's ward at the hospital, each labeled with a note of encouragement from Hannah and a poem from Mark. As they walked out, a nurse stopped Charles. "We've never seen a little girl light up this place like she does, or a man change so completely," Charles chuckled. "She's more powerful than she looks." The nurse smiled. "So are you." On a Sunday evening, near Christmas, the three of them stood on the front lawn, stringing up lights. Hannah wrapped herself in a scarf that once belonged to Lillian, repaired lovingly by Mark, who had taught himself to sew again. The scarf trailed in the wind as she turned to Charles. "You promised, right?" He blinked. "Promised what?" "That you'd always be here." Charles knelt, placing both hands on her shoulders. "Always. Even when you're taller than me. Even when you don't need me to tie your shoes. I'll be here." She leaned into his arms. "Then I'll make a candle for that." He smiled through the warmth swelling in his chest. "What will you call it?" "Forever." Inside, on the fireplace mantel, sat 3 candles. One for Mark, strength, one for Hannah, light, and one for Charles, home. They burned brightly, not just from flame, but from the love they carried. And in the soft flicker of that evening glow, in a house once filled with silence, a family found its voice. not through blood, but through poetry, courage, and the light of a little girl who never stopped believing in miracles.